Elizabeth, and good morning, everyone. I'm Greg Mullins, use he, him pronouns from the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington, and welcome you to the second day of the summer meeting and to this morning's presentation, Creating Strategic and Embedded Diversity Practices. Our presenter this morning is Andrea Jameson, Assistant Professor of Teaching and Learning at Illinois State University. And some housekeeping before we begin. You'll notice that you came into the room muted, and we'll ask that you remain muted. During the meeting, if you become unmuted and you aren't speaking, Elizabeth Duell will mute you. If you have any problems, please send a private Zoom chat message to Elizabeth. During the Q&A period, if you'd like to speak, please use the raised hand icon, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. If you go to the icon with reactions and the smiley face and plus sign, you'll find that raised hand icon. Also, feel free to post questions or comments in the chat. We are recording today's sessions and we'll be posting that on the web. You'll get an email message when that's available for you to view. With the housekeeping done, it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrea Jameson, Assistant Professor of Teaching and Learning at Illinois State University. Professor Jameson has been working for more than 17 years in schools and libraries, speaking internationally on issues related to creating inclusive learning spaces for youth and the interplay of race, power, and privilege in children's books. Her current research involves examining equity issues in library services and roles that libraries play in either perpetuating or mitigating systems of inequity. Professor Jameson has a Master of Teachings from Concordia University and a Master of Library Science and PhD in Information Studies from Dominican University. She is chair of the ALA's Ethnic and Multicultural Information Exchange Roundtable, which promotes multiculturalism in library services. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you, Greg. And good morning, greetings to everyone. Welcome, thank you for joining me for today's session. Again, my name is Andrea Jameson. I do want to talk a little bit about give a little bit more information about my experiences prior to beginning the conversation. And one of the reasons I want to talk about my experiences is because the conversation that I'm going to present today really draws on my experience in public academic school libraries. And so while I currently work at Illinois State University in Illinois State, it's about 2 hours outside of Chicago. Prior to that, I did work at Valparaiso University. I worked at Valparaiso University as a diversity fellow. I spent 2 years at Valparaiso. Prior to that, I spent 17 years in elementary school, and that time was split between working as a self-contained teacher as well as a school library media specialist as well. And then for a very short period of time, and I mean very short, I also worked in public libraries with youth services, working with youth as well. So I bring a lot of that experience, or I try to bring a lot of that experience to the conversation that I plan to have with you on today. So if you advance to the next slide, I want to share my contact information. So after today's session, if you have any questions, you can reach me via email. I'm always willing to share resources or to share information. I'm also always willing to answer questions. You can also reach me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is #AShyTownJ. 1 mild disclaimer, I have not been as active on Twitter as I probably should be, because I do like to have conversations about diversity, and I do like to have those conversations online. However, I have found that on Twitter, I am very tempted to say things that I should not be saying. But I do encourage you, if you're interested in networking with me, and if you want to connect via Twitter, I am always open to that. One of the things that I am planning to do this fall is to infuse social media, particularly Twitter, in my curriculum, because I think sometimes I find with my classes, we have very powerful and very meaningful conversations around diversity. And I think those conversations need to be extended. So I want to give students the opportunity to talk across different campuses and have the opportunity to sort of share ideas with groups in different spaces and in different places, so that we can broaden the message of the messages about diversity, and we can make this conversation more meaningful and engage more communities. So with that being said, before I start talking about today's session, I do want to kind of provide a context for why this session is about creating strategic and embedded diversity practices. Okay? So as librarians, I think that we have to be more intentional with regards to how we approach maintaining inclusive spaces. I don't think that it's enough for us to simply plan to implement diversity initiatives or just have goals that try to increase the presence of diversity in our respective organizations. We have to begin thinking about ways to sustain that diversity and to make diversity normative. Right? We want to make sure that our organizational spaces are able to foster um, rich conversations about diversity, foster mutually respectful relationships across different types of cultures and experiences. I use the terminology foster, but I also want to say nurture. Right? We want to make sure that we have organizations that are ready for diversity and that can nurture pluralistic communities. If we don't have those types of communities, then what will happen is that we will undoubtedly keep seeing these revolving doors of diversity starting and stopping, diverse communities coming into our environment, but not staying long. Right? Or having communities that feel that the environment that they're in is hostile. So in the work that I do and in the work that I have done, I often have witnessed this phenomenon of schools, particularly in academic settings, where you have library programs that have these ongoing discussions about the need to recruit more diverse students, right? Because we definitely know that when it comes to the field of librarianships, that diversity in terms of hiring and in terms of human resources, from a human resources perspective, diversity, there's not a lot of representation, right? So a lot of these conversations talk about discussing ways to recruit minoritized, and I use the word minoritized very deliberately, minoritized communities and how we can reduce those barriers of entry. But these conversations sometimes negate to discuss whether or not the environment that seeks to bring in more diverse representation, whether it's students, whether that environment is ready to embrace diversity. At Illinois State University, some of the committees that I sit on the Student Interest Committee. And one of the things I often talk about amongst my colleagues is the fact that we spend so much time talking about we have to make sure that our faculty, that we're culturally competent. But we never really bring students into that conversation, because our students, the diverse population that we're seeking to bring into our universities, their interaction with faculty will be a small percentage of their experience on campus. The other time is spent interacting with other students. Have we prepared those other students to be in an environment where they are forward thinking in terms of being culturally competent, or in terms of thinking of people as humans, right? I want to point your attention to a body of research that was presented by Brown and Juvenet in 2018, and I quote, Brown wrote that diversity, while it has the potential to facilitate inclusion and acceptance across groups, the mere presence of multiple groups can create conditions that foster exclusion. Right? I want you to think about that for a moment. Not only can it foster exclusion and a sense of marginalization when groups are seen as too dissimilar, or when you have environmental norms that do not support cross-group relationships, but instances of prejudicial treatment tend to arise, and our prejudiced attitudes arise, or then you start having these instances where people, where communities of color or communities from varying experience feel like they are experiencing microaggressions, or they're having conversations with people where words are being said or used that make them feel as if they are being othered. Right? So making sure that our communities are ready, we have to make sure that we're supporting not only our diverse communities, but if we want to start thinking about diversity as being normative, we also have to support those that are within the dominant group as well. We have to have structures in place that will make sure that they are getting the necessary exposure to a rich curriculum that exposes them to being culturally competent, to being forward thinking about diversity and about people, in a sense that we're just humans, right? And making the idea of a pluralistic society normative in our spaces. This conversation has to extend beyond just what happens in the classroom. I find that when I am working with students, students often say what they want me to hear. Oftentimes when I introduce myself, when I began working with the class, and I love my students, I love working with pre-service teachers and pre-service librarians, because I love the eagerness that they have and that desire that they have to really provide a service to people. And so I feel that they're very malleable and that you can really share information. And I think that learning is often didactic. So I am in the place where I feel as if I am growing as well. But when I am in front of my students and they know what my research is and they know that I am devoted and I am very passionate about EDI, when I start talking to students about teaching strategy and when I start talking to them about anti-oppressive pedagogies, I oftentimes sit back and when I listen to students, I find that I have a classroom of students who tend to parrot what I have said. And while that is great because I know that they are listening, I really want diversity to have meaning to them, right? They are able to articulate the meaning that it has to me, and particularly people that are dissimilar to them, that may be from varying backgrounds. But for there to be true allyship and diversity, there has to be a connection between the person that may be a part of the dominant group. They have to have complete buy-in, and they have to have an intrinsic value and an intrinsic motivation for wanting to connect with people, regardless of their socioeconomic status or regardless of their background or regardless of that lived experience. So we need to move beyond just having conversations about diversity in the classroom. We have to make sure that we give students opportunity to foster that type of culturally respectful community outside. We have to give those opportunities of engagement outside of the classroom as well. As a matter of fact, I am an advocate. It needs to be everywhere that we are trying to exude or exhibit the message of diversity. Right. So also the message of, and then I could talk about that not only from just the standpoint of universities. When I consult, I talk to universities about the need to just not bring in more students into the library science programs, and ultimately bring into increase the number of individuals of color or from different backgrounds or lived experiences in the field of librarianship. But there's also conversations that we have about collection development. I have these conversations oftentimes around this idea that that libraries are trying to really make a concerted effort to increase the representation within their collections. But then some of the pushback that I hear has often revolved around this idea that we are buying diverse books, but they're not circulating, right? And so sometimes that can be a little daunting because we feel that if our efforts are futile. And to that, I say we have to go beyond just this idea of just let's just increase diversity. We have to think about a holistic approach. We have to make sure that our patrons, our students, and everyone that walks into that library, they first understand our position. They're very clear about our position about diversity, and diversity is humanity. right? Diversity is not a project, it's not an initiative. But once they are clear about our position about diversity, how we present that material to our communities, how we shelve them, how we label them, all of that can send messages to our community about the importance of diversity. And let me kind of shape that just a little bit more, because this conversation also evolves out of my research. And in my research, I looked at libraries. I examined collection development policies to determine whether or not collection development policies had manifest messages of diversity. And the reasons why, one of the reasons why I conducted this study is because I find in the field of librarianship, we often tout diversity as being part of our core values, but there's a little evidence of practice that really points to whether or not our practices align with our core values. So there are not a lot of evaluative studies that really get at interrogating our practice at librarianship. So we have this conversation, but we don't know whether or not how we are faring in terms of these conversations and articulating these ideas that diversity is meaningful. Okay? So what I found is that I would look at policies, and on the first pages of those policies, maybe the first one or two pages of those policies, I would see, or I would find messages of diversity that would say we are a very diverse community. Or I would find statements that say we have a diverse collection. And that would be a statement that would always fascinate me, because I would ask myself, well, what does it mean when you say you have a diverse collection? Are you talking about formats, or are you talking about people? And when we talk about diversity in the context of inclusion or equity, diversity, and inclusion, diversity is always about people, right? But I would look on the first page and I would see that message very clear, because there's often always this diversity statement. And I don't have enough time to really talk about how I feel about diversity statements. But I will say that I looked at some policies that were 400 or 500 pages long. Yeah. Right. And on the 392 other pages, diversity was not mentioned. And the rubric that I created to assess diversity, manifest messages of diversity, was very broad, because I looked at not just terms of diversity, but I also looked at terminology that could stand as a replacement or have a semblance and meaning to diversity. So I looked at words like for all people, fair, equitable, equity. I looked for those terms as well. And so I would find that out of a 400-page policy, diversity was mentioned once or twice on the first page. Well, what happens if you have someone reading that policy, particularly if you have students looking at that policy, if you make your policies transparent, which policies should be transparent? But what happens if you also have new librarians in the field looking at that collection development policy, and you are giving that new librarian the impression that diversity is important, but as they go through that policy, by the time they get to page 50, or by the time they get to page 100, that message of diversity is lost. Okay? And so that leads to a broader conversation about this idea of embeddedness, which I talk about in my dissertation. And I also am working on a book with Roman and Littlefield. I hope I got their name correct, but it's for the Phi Beta Mu Scholars series. And I'm also going to talk about that more in the book. And again, if you want more information, I will be happy to share it with you. But what happens is that in a document, it's very clear, because I performed a content analysis. And Laura Numeroff, who is the guru on content analysis, talks about the idea of space. If you have a document that has 15,000 words, but diversity is only mentioned 10 times within the totality of that document, then we can approximate the relative importance of diversity based on how much space it is given. So I applied that idea to the broader context of libraries. How much space is diversity? And that is a question that I ask over and over when I'm talking to deans of libraries, or when I'm talking to directors or library administration. I ask, how much space is diversity given in your respective institution or in your respective programs? Do you have 2 or 3 or 4 diversity programs out of 100? right? And if that is the case, then those programs can easily get lost in the shuffle of all the other programs. And that meaning, if you say that diversity is a core value, that meaning becomes lost in translation. So when you think about embeddedness, think about normalization, right? Diversity has to be a part of everything that we do in all of our messaging, not just in our mission statements in a diversity statement, but we have to have that message embedded and threaded throughout those policies that house that mission statement, throughout our goals. We have to have tangible goals, and we also have to have it mirrored within spaces of our policies and our procedures and our practices. And our policies have to have teeth, right? We have to identify what behaviors we will tolerate. We will tolerate from faculty, we will tolerate from students, from our patrons, and the consequences of such behaviors. Now, ideally, we're not trying to be punitive in our spaces, but we want to send a clear message that anti-Asian sentiment is not accepted, or that we will not tolerate any type of negative comments or any type of homophobia or Islamophobia or anti-Semitism in our spaces, that is not the norm, that the norm is that we treat people as human beings, right? Okay. So another thing I want to add is that when I have these conversations and I talk to libraries about the element of diversity and about making diversity normalized, it's very interesting because a lot of times universities say we are very focused on diversity, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And not only out of 100 programs do they have only 2 or 3 diversity programs. When I walk through the building, I don't see signs of diversity until I reach their multicultural center, or until I reach that one space on that entire campus that is devoted to welcoming people from varying backgrounds. And again, this conversation has been designed, and while it may be an uncomfortable topic to some degree, I want it to be a very transparent conversation about what we need to do about really interrogating ourselves and interrogating our practices to say, what do we need to do? What else do we need to do to move diversity forward and just move beyond the idea of conversations and implementing programs to making diversity more sustainable? And so I know that that was a long context, but we can now move into the actual PowerPoint presentation. So next slide. All right. So let's talk about a little bit more conversation about what diversity is. And so diversity, the rise and resistance, and why this conversation is so important. If we think about diversity, diversity is a very broad catch-all phrase that has been used to describe a variety of experiences, right? And so because it is so broad, we as librarians, we have to make sure that when we are saying that we are inclusive, that we are a diverse community, we have to be very specific with that, right? We have to specify we have to have a clear definition of what diversity is in our community, what it looks like in our community, and what it is not. I am very adamant about that because we have to ask ourselves who's included and who's not included. The term diversity is so broad that it tries to capture everyone's experiences. And while that is a very notable or a very admirable cause, the problem is it becomes so big that it accomplishes very little. Right? So we have to begin to really start breaking it down and making diversity more nuanced. And then what happens is when diversity accomplishes very little, and you can go to the next slide. And the idea that diversity is so broad that it accomplishes little is a term that was dubbed by a scholar. I want to say that it's by Dr. Davis, but I would have to double check that, and I can share that information with you at a later time. But because it's so big, it has led to these ideas of these sort of romanticized ideas of color blindness, right? Where you have people that sort of buy into this attitude where I don't see color. right? And the problem with colorblindness is that when we say that we don't see race, or we don't see people based off of the color of their skin, but we judge them based on the content of their character, the problem with that is that we negate the fact that there have been people who have been historically marginalized and oppressed because of their race. So it is very important that we identify those groups to help mitigate the lingering inequities that may still work against those communities, right? So then it becomes a conversation about identity politics. It becomes about making sure we bring those groups that have been historically marginalized to the forefront so that we can start to mitigate some of those inequities. I'm sure everybody has seen the picture of difference between equality and versus equity, right? So we want to make sure that those groups that have been historically marginalized, they don't get lost in a shuffle, that we start to prioritize those groups. And I would always argue, prioritize those groups based on need, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about based on what that need is, because we have to be responsive to what is happening in our society, socially and culturally, what's happening to groups, so that when anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, or anti-Asian sentiments or homophobia, when those types of sentiments start to present themselves within our society, we can make sure that we front load our efforts and our priorities to support those groups, right? Again, it is important to be strategic about what diversity means and to define it, to identify who's represented and who's missing. Now, whenever I have this conversation in the context of collection development, a lot of times I get, and understand, I'm going to be very transparent with you because I have a very broad community and a network of diverse members within that community, and we really lean and draw on each other for support. So when I have these conversations, I try to be as transparent as I can, and I ask people that I am learning from to be very transparent with me, because I often hear from my friends who are my allies and who are allies to various communities and who I share allyship with. I hear conversations about, well, I don't know what to say, and when I say certain things that get taken the wrong way. And so I feel as if I'm walking on eggshell. So I try to be very open, and I really try to have very non-judgmental conversations. And so I put that out there to say that although I am devoted to equity, diversity, and inclusion, I am still learning as an African-American female. I am still learning and I am growing, and that I too have a lot to learn about other cultures and about groups that are dissimilar from my own experiences. But when I talk about diversity in the context of collection development, about being more specific, that we have to name communities, we have to identify what diversity really, who is represented. I mentioned earlier in the conversation that when I looked at policies, I would often see these policies that would state that we have a diverse collection, and I would question, well, what does diverse mean? Are you referencing people, or are you referencing the type of collection? But then another question that evolves from that is this idea of who's included in that. Right? If I walk into your library, or if you have a patron that walks into your library, and that patron happens to be an African-American person who identifies as being a part of the Muslim community and also a part of the LGBT community, are they represented on your shelves? And so when we start talking about diversity, we have to move away from being very ambiguous and just saying we are very diverse because we have representation of Black people, or because we have representation of the LGBT community, or because we have representation of the Pacific Islanders. If you have looked at the data that is on CCBC, from the Cooperative Children's Book Council, you will see that the CCBC has started to really break down different categories for diversity. And I think that is very telling, and it should be a very good driving point for how we should start thinking about diversity. We should begin to break down diversity. And while it may seem like it's such a daunting task, the benefit of that is that it will let us know who's included, so we can have opportunities to grow by identifying who's not there, right? And so that gives us areas where we can start working on those specific areas that we need to really increase our diversity initiatives. Diversity is not, and I won't say initiatives, I apologize, our diversity as being normative, because diversity is not just about having these projects. Diversity, again, is about making, inspiring culture. Okay? You can go to the next slide. So there are some real issues in librarianship with regards to diversity. I'll take when it comes to collection development, we have to be very cognizant that a lot of the books, especially the books with regards to children's literature, a lot of those books point to the ongoing need for librarians to really communicate with publishers about the need for more representation, and not just representation in who has been given the voice, but how they are presented in books, how different communities are presented in books, and also whether or not there is authenticity. So there's issues revolving around authenticity as well as representation. Right? There's also issues in terms of our collections. How are we putting our diverse books on the shelves? Are we labeling them, and we're categorizing them as African American books, or we're categorizing them as books for Spanish books or Latino books? If we are doing that, we have to be cognizant that our actions are not sending a message that we do not want to intend to send. Whereas sometimes you may have a person that might be interested in reading a book, but if we have stigmatized that book by the way we have classified it, then someone might assume, well, that book is not for me because that book is for African Americans, right? When we talk about windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, diverse books is not just for diverse communities. Diverse books are for everyone. So we have to start thinking about ways that we are presenting our collections, how we are introducing our materials to our patrons and to our students, because we really want to stretch them and open them up to the idea of being willing and being open to learning from various different types of communities. Also, there's an issue in human resources. I worked at a university, the university I work at now and the university I worked at before, the conversations have evolved immensely around this idea that we need to recruit more faculty of color. But the conversations tend to stop there. We have to move beyond those conversations of recruiting faculty of color, because a lot of the research points to the fact that when you have faculty of color, particularly when you have women, that academia has been hostile to women in higher ed. And so when you're thinking about bringing in faculty of color and you have, or faculty from different experiences, and those faculty take over in those classes, and then you have students who have never had someone who may have been African American or may have been part of the LGBT community, now teaching them, you have to ask yourself, what is that experience like for those students, right? Is that an optimal condition? Because what we tend to do is that we hold everyone to the same standards, but we don't think about those very different, those nuanced situations that may create very different experiences for our diverse communities. So those are issues as well. And then when we talk about programs in academia, we're also talking about the need to just bring in more diverse students. But we bring in diverse students, but our curriculum, we don't have a curriculum that support diversity. Oftentimes when we talk about, for example, and I'll use a young adult literature because I often teach selection and use of young adult literature. That is a class within itself. When I took it in my for my MLIS studies, it was a class and we spent 2 weeks talking about diversity. Well, we have to think about our curriculum in terms of, does our curriculum really convey the message of diversity? Are we offering courses that will be appealing to diverse communities, opportunities for them to really study and delve into areas involving equity, diversity, and inclusion that would allow them to contribute, right? Because when we work with our students, we want our students to be seekers of information. information. We want them to then be users of information, and then we want them to be disseminators of information. So we want our students to learn about the librarianship and all of the different fields and the nuances of our job, but we also want them to be able to explore areas that will be of interest to them so that they can contribute to the research and the scholarly information out there that may help improve our understanding with regards to some of these conversations. Next slide. Right. So I always I like to always draw this conversation, bring this into the conversation about diversity. This is a quote that I like to share about from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once stated that a social movement that moves people is merely a revolt. I look at diversity projects and diversity initiatives that start and stop and that are not fully funded as revolts. Right? It's something that we are just trying to disrupt the status quo. But we have to move from just disrupting the status quo to actually really sustaining change. And so a movement that changes both the mindset, that changes people and institutions is a revolution. And so when I talk to libraries, I think it's very important that we think in terms of equity, diversity, and inclusion in terms of revolutions, right? And not just off and on again projects and initiatives. Next slide. Okay. So one of the things that we have to do, right? We have to have a culture shift. When we talk about making diversity normative, we have to think about what do we need to do to support everybody within our community, not just the communities that are dissimilar or our diverse populations, but how do we build more allies within our own existing population, right? We have to make commitments. And one of the biggest commitments that I think that we can make is a financial commitment, but also a commitment of time, right? Our diversity, and some diversity initiatives, they start, and as soon as funding is cut, those programs stop. And if we want to see true change, we have to make sure that we have long-term goals with regards to inclusivity. So one of the ways to ensure that we have long-term goals is to make diversity part of our core values, make sure it's embedded in our mission statements, our goals, our vision statements, make sure that it's also embedded within our policies and procedures, and then eventually into our day-to-day practices. And again, making sure that our practices have some type of teeth to them. You have to also develop empathetic leadership. If we want to talk about making an environment that is conducive and changing the mindset of people, we have to really begin to think about this idea of how can we foster the idea of empathy. There's a body of research that when we talk about empathy, when we teach empathy, empathy has the ability to foster better relationships between people, not only interculturally, but intraculturally as well. And then we want to strive for balance, not this idea of quotas, right? I've often heard librarians ask me, well, how much diversity is enough? Right. And one of the things I say, which I've learned from a mentor of mine, Dr. Krista Arison, is that the goal is not for numbers, is not to look at the numbers. The goal is to say, how can we strive for balanced, right? Balanced faculty, because a balanced faculty brings in balanced viewpoints, but also balanced collections, right, as well, and balanced services, right? And you also want to talk about have critical evaluations. We have these programs, we have to make sure they are effective. And if they are not effective, if they're not producing the results that we want to see, we have to be willing to go back to the drawing board and to be willing to make substantial changes. Next slide. Okay. So here are some of my diversity recommendations, right? The first one is make financial investments, right? Make financial investments in your collection development, where there is money that is earmarked, consistently earmarked to improve or increase inclusivity in your collections, and that should be ongoing, right? We should think about it in terms of not just increasing diversity this year, right? Because again, diversity is so broad and it's so nuanced. It's so broad and it can be so ambiguous. We have to really get at the nuances of diversity. So our understanding of diversity will change as our society evolve, as we begin to identify more communities that have been unheard. As those communities are brought to the forefront, we want to make sure that we have funding that is available to support those communities when society tells us we need to demonstrate or we need to show support to certain communities who are experiencing hostile situations in our society. Right? We want to bring those communities to the forefront. So our financial commitments, they need to be long-standing financial commitments. We need to move away from this idea that if funding is cut, our diversity programs are the first to go. Because if they're the first to go, that means that you have to ask yourself, what is the importance of that program if it is so dispensable? Right? We have to also make investment in humans. Right? We have to invest in not only the training, and oftentimes when we think about training, sometimes the idea of training is forced. I attend this class or I attend this workshop just to say that I have attended it. But again, as I mentioned about my students, making diversity more meaningful is not just having my students regurgitate what I have said to them. I need for diversity to be more meaningful for them. So I try to talk to the community, the school community that I'm in. We try to brainstorm ways that we can bring the experience of diversity and to create opportunities to facilitate mutual understanding across different cultures. We try to bring it outside of the classroom. So you have to have those opportunities for human interaction that's meaningful, that's outside of the classroom, that's outside of mandated diversity trainings, where there can be real interactions that can foster relationships. Relationship building is important to sustaining diversity. You want to make sure, again, that the messages of diversity are a part of your core values, that you just don't articulate it, but your practices. You're doing everything to align your practices to those core values. Everywhere that if I walk into your space, everything, if I read online that your mission statements say that you foster an environment that is inclusive and that's welcome, or that reflects the pluralistic society that we live in, or the world that we live in, that message should be embedded everywhere, not just the library. So as libraries, we can't think in terms of silos. We have to be leaders, even in our institutions, about the conversations of diversity, even if that means working with other departments, showing other departments what we are doing in terms of being diverse, in terms of being inclusive. So and supporting those departments, because we are the libraries, we have to support those departments. And so, for example, when we start thinking about signage, if we have signage that mirrors the messages of inclusivity, or that everyone's accepted, if we have the ability to print those signs within our library programs, maybe we can work with other departments and we can offer that same type of services to print messages for them, so that they can also have those types of messages within their respective spaces. Because a student should feel continuity when they are walking through a university space, from the library to the athletic department to everywhere they're going on campus. That message of diversity should be a continuous message that is throughout. And again, that means that we have to be willing to step out of our confines and work with other departments and assert our expertise in this area and say, no, this is what we're doing, this is what we've learned, and this is what works. Another thing that I often say is that if you are at a university, particularly if your university has a collection, especially a youth collection, and you want that youth collection, particularly if you have a program that supports working with youth and you offer that program at that university, it is very important for the library to have a really good relationship with the teaching department department or the College of Education that works with those students, so that even if there is a separate collection, you can work together to make sure that you offer more diversity or more inclusion in your collection, and that you're not just duplicating efforts. So having those relationships across departments is very important. Next slide. And I think I'm winding down to the last few slides, and then I will open it up for questions, right? So again, it's very important that we address culture and climate, right? And so in addressing culture and climate, we want to make sure that we prepare allies, that we increase allyship, not just in our faculty, but also within our student body as well, right? We want to make sure that diversity is the standard, right? And not necessarily the goal. We want to make sure that this is something that we do, not something that we are trying to do, because the message of trying to do says that if we fall short of it, then oh well, we fall short of it. But if we change that dynamic, if we change the way we think about it, then what we are saying is falling short is not an option, right? Because there are too many people and too many communities that we are impacting. We are preparing too many students to go out into a world, and they are going to work with groups that are dissimilar to them. And we want to create, we want to contribute to harmony in the world, as opposed to contributing to all of the social ills that already exist, right? Part of this is also, if you want to change a culture and to change the climate, you have to agree upon language, right? One of the first things I say when I consult with libraries, I often say, well, do you have agreed upon language, right? What will be used and what will not be used in terms of addressing communities. Some communities use BIPOC, some communities use diverse groups, and then some communities still use terminology that we really have to explore and wonder. We have to ask ourselves: are the terms that we use really reflective of where we want to be in terms of forward thinking about these communities? Are some of the terms still? Are we using terms that's dated or still not reflective of where we want, where we are or want to be in terms of our inclusion? And I will give you an example of that. I have gone to many places and many conferences, and I've been in many environments where I hear the conversation or the term minority used a lot. And I bring that up as I started this conversation by saying minoritized. And I meant that very deliberately. When you start thinking about terminology like minority, right? If you are in a setting where you do have certain groups and they are a very small representation of your population, then denotatively minority makes sense. But if you're using minority in the term as a term to just represent people, then you have to also consider that connotatively it may be offensive to groups, because we are saying to those groups, what messages are we reinforcing to those groups by using certain terminology? So it's very important that you come together and you have those moments where you agree upon, well, these are the language. When we address certain type of communities, we are going to address them this way. And then when you have those agreed languages or that agreed language, you want that language to be used by faculty members in the classroom. You want that language to be used by staff. You want that language to be used in communicating with each other. We want to build a community where we agree upon shared language. By agreeing upon that shared language, then you start to dismantle that feeling of otherness or those instances of microaggression where you have conversation and then someone inadvertently says something and they may not intend to offend, but it comes off as offensive. Next slide. Okay. So you also want to address inequities in your policies. And I do not have enough time to really delve into the conversation about policies because this is really my wheelhouse. But in policies, you want to move away from the diversity statement. I talked about embeddedness. You want diversity to be, to be specific. So you want to have a level of specificity. You want it to be defined. You want it to be specific. You want to name communities, talk about who's included so you can identify who's not included so you can work on those areas. And then you also want the language and the message of diversity to be embedded throughout all of your policies and throughout all of your mission statements and everything else that whatever other messaging you're using to convey your messages and your core values for librarianship. And then lastly, it's the idea of transparency. And you can read more about this in my dissertation and again in my upcoming book as well. But transparency speaks to the idea of oftentimes when I conducted my research study, I went to libraries and I asked them, I told them that I'm looking at collection development policies. And I told them I'm looking at collection development policies because I'm doing a study on diversity. And I had many librarians reach out to me and say, we need work in this area, but they did not share their policy. And so we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? We have to be willing to interrogate our practices. And my research, I don't look at policies to negatively cast a light on libraries, but I look at policies and I look at other practices and procedures at institutions as a way of identifying commonalities to see what is working, to see what we're doing, and to see if what we're doing is really aligning to what it is that we are professing, right? So it's an opportunity to grow. And in order to grow, we have to be willing to interrogate ourselves. So transparency is very important. We have to put ourselves on the line and we have to share what we're good at and what we need, what we are challenged at, because only when we begin to communicate with others, we can begin to grow, right? And growth is really uncomfortable sometimes. Next slide. Okay. I want to talk about this idea of developing norms, having practices and procedures that become normative. And one of the things that I would recommend that we can do is this idea, particularly about students. Move the idea of being culturally competent away from just a responsibility of faculty. It is a responsibility of faculty, but we need to have a holistic approach. We need to also make sure that our students are ready and also that we are fully preparing them, because again, thinking back to the research of Brown 2018, that when you have communities that have been homogeneous for a significant amount of time, when they are placed into environments where groups are dissimilar to them, instances of racism and prejudicial attitudes now have the opportunity to manifest themselves, right? So whereas you may have people that did not know that they had implicit biases because they never had the opportunity to be in those environments, we have to start really making sure that we have supports in places. And so one of the things that you can do, and one of the things that I highly recommend, the American Library Association trained librarians to have these circles, these peace circles, right? And I was one of the librarians that was trained, but there you can go onto Olo's office and you could see the list of librarians that are trained to really try to facilitate racial harmony or cross-cultural harmony by having different types of circles that will really address some of the awkwardness that we may feel when trying to really get along with others and to learn from others. I know I have about 8 minutes left. I have a few more slides. I won't go into those slides again after this because I want to leave some time for questions. Again, I am more than willing to have these conversations with you. I am open to these conversations. So if you do want to email me, if you do want to look at some of my work, I can share that as well. Thank you so much. I think you've been a great audience, and I will now open it up to questions. And I think, Elizabeth, if there are any questions in the chat, I am open to try to do the best I can to answer them.
Thank you so much. At this point, I do not see any questions in the chat.
Okay.
Actually, thank you so much for your energy and insights. I got chills when you were talking about cultivating true allyship and fostering intrinsic value and motivation within others, students in your example. I want to learn how to do this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Diversity is something that I'm very much committed to. And when I talk to my students, I talk to my students about my experiences, right? I did a TED talk and a TEDx talk at Valparaiso. And I often start off with a quote that talks about ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. And I talk about my experiences that when I grew up in a socially and economically disadvantaged community. And so when I became a teacher because I wanted to impact change for other students who grew up in those types of environments. So when I talk about diversity, I'm not just talking about diversity from the standpoint of being an African American cisgendered female. I know what oppression feels like, and I talk about diversity from the standpoint of how can we make society a better place for everyone, right? Regardless of status, regardless of class, regardless of experience, and regardless about background. So I'm very devoted to humanity. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. We have one request for the Brown 2018 reference to share that as well as your dissertation. And we had one question going back to something you mentioned earlier on, then touched on again, labeling and signage. We are going to have a separate collection of popular items specifically purchased to support the university's diversity and equity work. Right now, they are settling for DEI, but are unsure whether this is appropriate. Perhaps borrowing Nintendo's E for Everyone label. Other suggestions?
I am against labeling, right? And so, and while I don't want to discourage you from moving in a direction that you may feel is best for your library community, one of the things I will say is that you have to be very careful with labeling, because if we want buy-in from our community, it's how we introduce diversity to our community is very important. So if we introduce diversity or collections as a diverse collection, then that can create unintended consequences where you might have community members that think about, well, I'm not really interested in diversity, so I don't want to look at those books. So what you want to do is, and I definitely advocate for increasing diversity in collections, popular collections, and making sure that there's representation throughout your entire collection. But you want to be very intentional about how you present those collections. And sometimes labeling it as a diverse collection sometimes creates stigmas that make people feel as if, well, if I'm not interested in learning about other groups or communities, or if I'm diverse, or I'm not a person who has hostility towards other groups, so I don't need to learn anything here, so there's nothing of value for me here, then those patrons may not be apt to really want to engage with that collection. So I would recommend that if you have any types of collections, you want to think of ways that you can display those collections based off of themes where you are just bringing in as many diverse books as possible, and you're making those diverse books and you're showcasing all people based on themes as often as possible and continually, so that your community can constantly see different communities, and they will get the idea that those communities are normative, that all communities are normative, as opposed to saying we have this diverse collection. Because again, it sends the message that it's separate and aside from what is normal or what is standard, right? I've had librarians say to me, well, sometimes that's difficult when you're building displays, because what if I'm building a display about Dr. Seuss? Well, even if you're building a display about Dr. Seuss or a particular author, the goal is to humanize, to bring the human aspect into our displays, and human meaning people. So even if you have books about Dr. Seuss, and I use that as an example, and I know there may be some opinions about Dr. Seuss, but you can have pictures of students reading Dr. Seuss books, or you can have pictures of faculty members talking about their favorite Dr. Seuss books, and you want to make sure you include pictures of everybody, again, to bring in that element that everybody matters and everybody's important.
I'd like to reiterate the thank yous that are in the chat for this amazing and energizing process. We are out of time.
I also want to thank Andrea, it's a very invigorating talk. I have writer's cramp from all the notes I've been taking during this time. I feel fired up and ready to go. And the chat comments indicate that that is a sentiment that's widely felt in our community. So thank you so much for making time to be with us here today. And a reminder to the participants that there's a survey for evaluation of this and all the sessions in summer meeting. The URL is on the slide, and there will be a recording so that we're able to go back and dig deeper and absorb more of what Dr. Jameson has been presenting to us today. Thank you so much, Andrea, for being with us.
Thank you.